So good afternoon, Your Holiness. A priority for mind and life is mapping the mind. And this is a priority because we feel that by having a map of how the mind operates, it will be very important in relation to the alleviation of human suffering. This is our motivation for this. And this morning, we had a very powerful presentation which was based on a brain map and also on neurochemical processes that produce certain states, particularly that of wanting and of liking. And Kent, in his presentation, decoupled wanting and liking, which was it's a very important point for us when looking at the cycle of addiction and as well as the cycle of craving. One of the meta questions that we're sitting with is in relation to the kinds of maps that have developed within Buddhism as well as Christianity and other traditions that relate to our human experience and how these maps map onto the brain. And this is a really powerful question that we're looking at. And this, Richie's work for so many years has been basically mapping neural circuitry, seeing how the brain operates, and also bringing the Buddhist perspective in with Jimpa and Mathieu and others of how great practitioners have discovered processes of mind that actually relate to what we're learning from neuroscience and neurochemistry. At a deep level also, in this set of explorations over the next days, where there's another dimension that we're looking at, and that is has to do with ethics. When is wanting wholesome and when is wanting unwholesome? And we're beginning to tease apart, through your perspective, the role of aspiration and the role also that greed plays in our society, and how we cultivate wholesome aspiration, and how we begin to diminish the greed factor in our culture at a global level.
wholesome study.
I think we also want to explore, as in the course of the discussion after Jimpa's presentation, how attention operates in these various states, whether it's the state of wholesome aspiration or wanting, desire, craving, and addiction, because we believe that attention operates in different ways in these different processes. And we also want to look at the question that Richie brought up yesterday, and that is the role of not only awareness, but also of metacognition in terms of interrupting the cycles of unwholesome wanting and addiction that are plaguing so many individuals. And finally, I hope that you will contribute, Vibhuka, to how social context influences how the brain operates. So Jimpa, who is your faithful translator, needs no introduction to you, but perhaps to some of you in the room. He graduated from Gandhi University. He got his PhD from Oxford. He's long been a translator. Cambridge, oops, sorry. He's long been a translator for His Holiness. And we're very fortunate that he is the chair of the Board of Mind and Life. I'm sorry about that. I'm sure your colleagues will forgive me. So Jimpa is going to give us a presentation on a Buddhist perspective in relation to desire and craving.
I usually prefer, you see, the psychology, not just Buddhist sort of psychology, but I prefer ancient Indian sort of psychology. So I think, as a matter of fact, I think Buddhist psychology also, you see, because of the broad learning from existent because of the
Indian system,
Indian sort of knowledge. So that's, I think, better.
Yeah.
then particular sort of view from the Buddhist viewpoint, then okay.
So thank you, Roshi. At the beginning, I would like to request Your Holiness to give me a permission to step outside my traditional role as your personal interpreter and to have this opportunity to present in my own voice. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to do this. And I'm acutely aware of the fact and also a bit of an irony that I'm making this presentation in your presence, as well as many of the great monastic scholars here. So, and in the process of trying to... His Holiness saying that they're all ready to pounce on. if there is any inconsistencies. So in the process of my trying to develop an interpretation of psychology of desire, craving, and action drawn from classical Buddhist sources, and trying to develop in a way that would interface with the contemporary scientific perspective, it is possible that I may have slightly overreached my interpretation. So if that is the case, please forgive me. So what I would like to do is, I also want to point out the fact that my presentation is unlike the scientist presentation. It's not to His Holiness, but primarily to my scientific colleagues, as well as the guests who are here. So what I would like to do is to really present, in some sense, the parallel understanding of the psychology that we have been talking about. We had two extensive presentations, one from Mark and one from Kent, with preceded by a general overview from both Diana and Richie of the contemporary Western understanding of these processes, and particularly with a particular focus on the problem of addiction. We were exposed to the very terrifying data by Diana about the mortality and the kind of illnesses and the dysfunction, the pervasive addiction to substance really caused in various societies. And Richie's data that he presented about over 30% of Tibetan males on the plateau of Tibet, Tibet Autonomous Region being in some form of alcohol abuse, was quite an alarming one, which also touched something quite closer to home, because in my own family on my mother's side, I remember having relatives who had that same condition. So what I would like to do is to really dig more deeply into this. I mean, one of the things that I would like to say at the outset is that if we understand the problem of addiction narrowly in the conventional medical sense of a medical pathology and a kind of a disease that needs to be treated, then the classical Buddhist sources don't really have much to say, because this is not the classical Buddhist scholars and psychologists concerned. Generally, if those kind of problems would be deferred to, physicians and counselors, not a purview of the Buddhist psychologists and scholars. But on the other hand, if we expand our concept of, what is an addictive behavior? What are the psychological mechanisms that underpins those kind of behavior? Primarily craving and attachment and desire. Then I think Buddhism has a lot to say. Buddhism has, right from the beginning, been very, very interested in the problem of craving. So what I would like to do in my presentation is to try to focus more on the addictive behavior in this generic sense. And also, one of the advantages of doing this is that if we narrowly define addiction as a kind of a pathology that we understand, then majority of the people probably will not identify themselves as an addict. So they will probably fail to see that the actual potential and the psychological underpinnings that lead to that kind of extreme behavior is really present in all of us. I mean, I, for one, can say that the craving is an issue, is an issue for me. And also as a as a father of 2 growing children, young children, I also take the question of craving, particularly living in a consumerist culture in the West, take it very seriously. Today we speak about addiction to digital devices. We speak of addiction to internet. Diana quoted George Bush's statement that Americans are addicted to oil. And we are, Richie spoke about the critical role the exercising of the self-control plays in determining or the correlation of how certain people may be disposed towards kind of more addictive behavior down later in age. And this, I think, and then you powerfully showed the video of the marshmallow experiment. And, I became aware of this experiment quite early, and I really made it a point to tell my 2 children about the marshmallow experiment, to the point that when we were at shops and one of the daughters want to buy something, the other one will say, remember the marshmallow marshmallow test. So I think it is an important a problem, and particularly in the consumerist age, this can be a tremendous challenge. In the video, we saw the children, reacting differently, kind of dealing differently to the challenge in front of them. There was a marshmallow in front of them. Some children were using avoidance tactics of looking around, and some children were kind of more focused, and some children were just tempting them around. You could see how children respond differently. Now imagine, the same experiment. Now only difference would be there could be another person who would be talking, speaking about the virtues of eating that marshmallow. How pleasurable it would be, how great it would feel, how sweet that is. Imagine the challenge that would pose, to the brain of those small children. This is essentially our modern consumerist society. Mm-hmm. We have not only access to all these gadgets and stuff, but also we are at the mercy of powerful advertisement industry, which find very clever ways of really tempting us. So in this kind of world, unless each of us as individuals find some way of dealing with this internally, we're really at the mercy of a very powerful force. Mm. And simple avoidance is not really possible for many of us. So I think there, I feel that, what is happening is 2 things that are happening. One is the kind of compulsion to really acquire, driven by craving, I feel is very deeply rooted. Buddhism, in the Buddhist psychology, it is recognized as one of the deepest instincts of human nature. The craving is considered to be such a deep part of our instinct. And from a modern evolutionary point of view, probably craving has very deep evolutionary roots. And what craving leads to is this compulsion to get stuff, acquire things, to somehow fill in some kind of vacuum that is within us, to give us a sense of security. So I think this is a very, very powerful force. And when that is combined with the sophistication of the advertisement industry, we are losing battle. We are really at a losing battle. So I think this kind of collaborative kind of thinking on the part of both neuroscience and clinical science on the one hand, psychology on the one hand, and the Buddhist contemplative traditions and the Buddhist psychology and generally in Indian tradition psychology on the other, which has looked deeply into the mental processes, the coming together, at least in principle, holds the promise of offering us something that would equip us as individuals to be able to handle the kind of problem we are faced with. And I, for one, believe that some form of addictive potential is there in all of us. It may translate differently. For some, it may translate in the form of substance abuse. For some, it may translate in the form of workaholism. I, for one, has been accused of that by my Tibetan colleagues. So I think the compulsive nature is there in all of us. So I would like to situate that as a background of my presentation. And this morning, Richie mentioned Ken's presentation as going into the brain, and hopefully my presentation would be the mind equivalent of that, going into the mind. So with that kind of preliminary comment, what I would like to do is to really look at some of the metaphors that are found in the early Buddhist texts. And I, for one, agree with one Western scholar who wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By, which suggests that the kind of metaphors that we use in a particular society and culture speaks a lot about that society's attitude and views about that phenomenon. So I have some quotations from some of the early texts, and for the benefit of my Buddhist colleagues, scholars here, I have added the Tibetan term. So one, very famous one is drowning in a mine of sensual desire. So there's this pleasure-seeking reference, being swept by currents of craving. So it's sort of the craving becomes so powerful, like you have no kind of ability to swim, above it. The thirst of craving, and in fact, the Sanskrit word for craving is trishna, or Pali is tana, which also can be translated as thirst, kompa. So it really kind of captures the quality of that. It's not just a form of wanting, but there is this kind of parching, thirsty quality to it. And another famous one, caught by the noose of craving. So it's like a kind of an entrapment. Once you are caught, it's like an animal that has been caught in the noose, and then bound by the long rope of craving. So it's not just a tiny rope, but it's a long rope. It's very difficult to undo it once you are caught in the cycle. So you can see in these kind of metaphors, the Buddhist tradition's kind of attitude to this and recognition of the challenge, the enormity of the challenge of trying to rise above this powerful instinct of craving. Now, the one thing that I would like to point to is this comes from a very, very early text. And one of the things that I'm very acutely cognizant of is His Holiness often reminds us, Buddhist scholars, when we bring ideas and insights from the Buddhist sources, in the kind of arena of discussion with scientists, it is important to bear in mind that there are two broad aspects of the contents of the Buddhist texts. One is a content that could be characterized as dealing with the kind of empirical nature of reality, so which is essentially scientific facts. So there's a lot of Buddhist understanding on the scientific level of the, whether it is about the physical world or whether it's about the mental world. Then there is a second aspect of the content of these Buddhist sources, which is more the philosophical aspects, which are really rooted upon the scientific facts that the Buddhists have discovered. And then finally, there is the religious or the spiritual aspects. And in these kind of conversations, as much as possible, we should try to stay at the level of this first domain. And once in a while, we may dip into the second domain, which is the philosophical. But the third domain should be really kind of bracketed. So this is what I've tried to do in my presentation. I don't know if I have succeeded. Here, I will read from a very, very early Buddhist text. Actually, this is attributed to the Buddha himself, more than 2,500 years ago. And these are the links in kind of a chain of craving. So craving is not seen as arising instantaneously when you come into contact with an object of temptation. There is a kind of a process. So then the Buddha says the conditioned by contact. Contact is the coming together of your sensory perception and the object in front of you. That's just a pure experience or a perception. So conditioned by contact, feeling arises. So when you have an experience, when you have a perception of something, then you have an affective response, whether it is pleasurable or unpleasurable or neutral. So that is the feeling component. And then conditioned by feeling, craving arises. So it's not so much the object that gives rise to the craving, but it's more the feeling that gives rise to craving. And then conditioned by craving, grasping arises. Now, there is a debate within the interpretation of these texts whether craving and grasping are kind of matters of degree of intensity, or whether grasping has a qualitatively different character. So there is a divergent of opinion, but again, there is a temporal stage. So just because you have a craving need not necessarily mean you will act. So there's a craving, and then there's a grasping, and then conditioned by grasping, becoming arises. Now, becoming is a technical term, but here we can read it as the actual action. So once you have craving, which then leads to grasping, then the action comes out of it. So this is a very, very early Buddhist understanding of the causation chain. So now to go a little bit deeper, because these are technical terms like contact, feeling, craving, grasping, and becoming. So what I've done is to really present a kind of one of the most influential views, understanding of these factors. This is from the 4th century master Vasubandhu from the Peshawar regions of modern-day Pakistan. He is, by the way, depicted over there. And he writes, and these are the definitions of what these factors are. He says, feeling or vedana is a state before the arising of lust. So it's really a kind of an effective response. There is no attachment in it. Then it says craving or trishna is the state when one lusts for sensual objects and sexual experience. So it's not just an object, but also an experience. And grasping, ubhadana, is a state when one runs after that object seeking gratification. So this grasping has a kind of a forward-moving kind of it's one could one would expect when the grasping areas is the motor part regions of the brain will be very active. And then becoming bhava is to engage in the act that leads to making the effect real. So the becoming is like the actual execution of. So I think this sort of, succinctly, teases out the differences between these various factors, which I think is helpful. Mark in his presentation showed the tanka of the wheel of life, which depicts actually the entire chain, which there are 12 links in the chain of dependent origination. So in that depiction, contact is represented by two people kissing. So it's like a kind of and feeling is represented by someone being shot in the eye. So it's a very raw experience. You can't miss it. And craving is represented by someone drinking alcohol. And grasping is represented by someone actually reaching for the fruit from a tree. And becoming is represented by a pregnant state. So where actually, a child is going to come any moment. And from this comes existence. So you can see that these are, one of the points I want to make is that these are processes and phenomena that the Buddhists have been thinking about for a long time, and also trying to kind of imagine and come up with metaphors that would really convey the idea quite concretely to less, scholarly kind of trained ordinary people. Now, let me step back a bit, because we are throwing a lot of terms like craving and desire and so on. So in the Buddhist sources, we use two key terms that are sometimes used interchangeably: attachment, dukkha, and craving, sepa. So I think sometimes they are used interchangeably, but sometimes they are used differently. And I just want to give you a kind of a nuance of the complexity of the terms, because this morning, in response to Kent's presentation and your comments on desire, His Holiness made the very important point that desire need not necessarily be destructive. There is a desire in the form of aspiration. This is one of the very, very early distinctions that is drawn. Said craving is something that is associated more with anticipation. It's a future directed. And attachment is more associated with liking. So there's this Jungwe Seba and Gawe Dochak. So this is, one way of looking at it. Attachment is more to present states of things and present moment objects, but also there is, along with it, some element of liking. But craving has more to do with future objects or future experience. Another distinction that is drawn, which is interesting, this is more complicated, is it talks about an existential craving, some kind of craving for continued existence. I mean, this is understood to be very, very fundamental to our. It's almost like kind of a kind of instinct for survival, one could say. I mean, that fundamental. And then craving as desire for sensory pleasure, so which is one form. And then the third one is interesting. It's there's a fear element. This morning we spoke about, the paradox you brought up, how the same brain systems, regions to be used by both fear and, kind of a desire. And here there is an understanding that there can be some form of craving where the basic drive is really fear. So, and here the fear is understood in the form of non-existence. It's essentially death, non-existence. Jigbe seba. So you can, now, this is again from another source and another different way of looking at the distinction between desire, attachment, and craving. And here it's craving as a yearning for future objects. So that's kind of anticipation, looking forward. And craving as attachment through not wanting to be separated. So this is a form of attachment. And then craving in the form of love for continued existence. So you can see that this one and the second one is kind of a different variation, but they're coming from different sources. So the main point I'm bringing these up is to show the complexity of these kind of ideas and the terms we are using. Now, the one that is most helpful here is to really make a distinction between attachment and craving. And here attachment is really seen as, here you can see that attachment has the nature of connecting thoroughly with one's desired object. So it's more like a kind of a generic form. But its function is to connect us with something that we desire, something that we, the object or experience. When clinging inappropriately to things that are in the present, it is called attachment. So now again in the same text, attachment is used as a generic term, and then again attachment is used as a specific term where the focus is more about present moment. So when clinging inappropriately to things that are in the present moment, it is called attachment. From the point of view of seeking future afflictive objects and states, it is called craving. So you can see, and not only so here this seems to suggest that craving is not just about yearning for something that is in the future, but there is an afflictive element built into this. So whether the afflictedness comes from the object or the particular state. So this is an interesting point that comes up, which we could potentially discuss. But the main point is attachment is to do with present, moment objects and states, and craving is about future. And also in both of these cases, it's to the afflicted objects and it's to the afflicted states. So built in this is a kind of a recognition that the craving is by its very nature, somehow afflictive. Now, let's move back to the factors that I listed earlier. Now, if you kind of illustrate in a kind of a diagram, we see, and also in the Wheel of Life Tanka, it's a circular. It's not a one-directional arrow or just one line. It's a cyclical. So we start with the contact, which is when perceptions come into contact with the object. which then give rise to feeling or experience. Then it leads to craving, and craving intensifies in the form of grasping, which then leads to action, and then the cycle goes on. Now, how does the cycle goes on? Here, the Buddhist, thinkers like Vasubandhu and others would makes the statement that you need the role of imagining, fantasizing, and the technical term we use is tsushimai bayela chepa, which literally translates as inappropriate mentation, thinking in an inappropriate way. So here, let me quote this. This is from Abhidhammakosha, the same text by the same author. He says, one has not abandoned the proclivities. So he's talking about ordinary people, why we are so kind of vulnerable to compulsive behavior. So he's talking about us. He says, one has not abandoned the proclivities, and the objects of temptations are nearby. So with inappropriate mentation, conditions for the arising of afflictions are complete. So yesterday in the question and answer session with the monastics, Geshe Lagdola cited that same verse. For Vasubandhu, for many of us, there are three conditions that are kind of ready. One is we have not abandoned the proclivities, so we have the proclivities within us. And then if the objects are nearby, and then when we start fantasizing, then the craving and other afflictions will arise. So the key concept being brought here is this idea of inappropriate mentation, which I think the psychologists and neuroscientists are using as kind of fantasizing or imagining. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly the same thing. What it involves is a kind of a projection. So if it is to some attractive object, you attribute, attractiveness, quality far greater than what is actually justified. So there's an element of exaggeration, element of mental projection, and fantasizing. So this is what is generally referred to as inappropriate mentation. So it's not just the perception that gives rise to it. It's not just the experience give rise to it, but on the perception and the experience, you then need that extra element to start the cycle of craving. His Holiness caught a spelling error in my slide. So now in order to, so let's go back to this. So you have the perception or the contact, you have the experience or the feeling, and then we add another element, which is sublink, which is this imagining or fantasizing or inappropriate mentation. And then you have the craving. But that still need not necessarily perpetuate a cycle. So what is needed? Now to add here, this is something that I found, in the process of doing a research. I was looking for, in the classical Buddhist text, Your Holiness, if I could find any reference to the problem of actual addiction and what would be the term that we would use for alcohol addiction. In the colloquial Tibetan term, we use taken over by alcohol, taken over by drugs, taken over by gambling. So kerwa, changkerwa or bakerwa. But in colloquial, in the classical Tibetan text or Buddhist text, I was looking for one, and I found this very interesting phrase: excessive devotion. So here, this is basically the role of habituation. So you need, in addition to imagining and fantasizing and craving, you need some form of habituation to start the cycle. So the text reads, "He who constantly grieves, in him rises ever more grief. And just as the love of sleeping leads to excessive need for sleep, and know this to be true too of attachment and craving, as well as of excessive devotion to alcohol." So it's very interesting that in this text, it would really put addiction next to attachment and craving. So so the main point here is that you need the repeated use, because just because you have a craving need not necessarily lead to addictive behavior. So that's the main point I'm trying to make. So if we kind of now that we have the contact and perception on one, then you have the feeling or the experience, then you have the inappropriate mentation, the imagining and fantasizing, then you have the craving, and then, you know, not only you indulge in the action, but you need to indulge in it repeatedly before you start the cycle. So this is the role of habituation. So if we bring all of this together, so these are the four main kind of links. I've actually collapsed them so that they're into four now. So you have between this and this, you have that one. So sort of imaginings and inappropriate mentation and fantasizing. And then you have law. Inappropriate. So it's not simply thinking about it. No, it's not simply thinking about it, but you're thinking about it in a kind of a heightened way, in a fantasized way. You're exaggerating. So that's why the term inappropriate mentation is used. Because generally mentation is not necessarily a problem. It's a form of attention that you pay. So when you take something seriously, something to be important, you pay attention. But what you're doing is you're paying attention, but in an inappropriate way, which is,
I think, to the salience.
Yes, that's the idea. Where, you know, generally you pay attention to things that are important for you, but here, yeah. So there's a kind of a focus and an attention, but it is an attention that has all these other toxic qualities to it. Yeah. So that really is the idea. That's why the word mentation or attention is used.
Or appraisal.
Appraisal, yeah.
다 causation 할 때 되었다 된다. 그래서 수신만이 남도 도다야 돼. 다 잡고 담벌지야 돼.
네.
So higher level of ignorance, deeper level of I don't know.
So from the Buddhist point of view, His Holiness was explaining that yesterday we had a discussion of the role of ignorance that plays, the reason why we tend to instinctively
deeper level of ignorance.
Explanation. So the reason why we instinctively tend to kind of exaggerate and fantasize about something that we like is because there is a deeper level of grasping at some kind of intrinsicness, kind of absolute or concreteness of the experience and the object. And this is at a deeper level. It's a form of ignorance.
I think this morning I mentioned similarly, theistic religious believer, when this negative emotion you develop, then remember God, our Creator. For example, when we met someone who you dislike, right? You're about to develop anger or these things, then we think that person also created by God, so therefore the image of God. So immediately you see the intensity of dislike reduce. So this
so it's the same kind of idea. No.
So different religious philosophy. I think they not mentioned, not use the same word, but I think the purpose, more or less same. Try to reduce the intensity of these negative emotions. So deeper philosophical views. Isn't it? Yesterday you mentioned God loves one.
No. So now, how does craving lead to grasping? So that's, from the Buddhist point of view, that seems to be the key step. You know, so how does craving translate into grasping? So, by the way, the grasping is sometimes translated also as appropriation. So the different translators use different terms for this. The Sanskrit word is upadana, Tibetan word is lempa. So it is really through continued reinforcement of the craving with no antidote. So if you don't bring any conscious awareness, no.
세버스전에 초 디둘이야 차르체.
나래.
다 렘버스전에 초 디두 용약이 자 뇌외연 가소래. 속절 소들을 차지. 지금도. 말베. 셀린이 개발시도 전에 뇌사 이부터 찍버리디 세버디 초 디두 장장 강 삼다 되겠지. 렘버디 디두 용세 유 속절 소들을 차고도 말베. 말베. 是吧? 디켜봐도 가. 어디?
그래. 되네. 나는 변쟁이 제베나 숙취종랑 돈 샤샤르.
그래, 좀 쉬어. 되자 숙차도 심버디 세벤이고 당구들 람바.
람바도 숙취에 자고.
당구 세베시 람바.
So it seems that there's also an understanding that the distinction between craving and grasping is that in craving, the focus is really more about the experience. And
about
experience. And whereas in the grasping, then the objects also play a greater role because you're running after it. So that's one way of distinguishing. But the point I'm trying to make is, what is it that makes craving to culminate in the form of a grasping? So one suggestion here is that if you allow craving to be unchecked, then it leads, with no kind of antidote, and you keep reinforcing it, then it leads to grasping, which then forces you to kind of get the stuff. So here, I mean, from an ordinary personal point of view, many of us will have craving when we're confronted with many of the things that are out there being sold. If we don't bring some conscious kind of awareness into this, then craving becomes sort of almost subconscious. The craving arises and we just follow it. So I think here the idea is, and then craving leads to greed. And when greed happens, then there is a disconnect between what you actually need and what you want. I mean, in an ideal world, what you want and what you need would have a closer relation. And the problem with greed is that connection is broken. So then the craving just, the wanting goes unchecked. Now, the grasping leads to action because the grasping makes us pursue the object blindly. So when you have this grasping, then you become kind of oblivious to any negative consequences there might be in the course of pursuing what you want. So this is one aspect of the grasping. And then, I don't know what happened to the fourth one. Okay, so then this leads to action, and from action, how do we form a habit? Well, this is through constant use. So then once you have that, then the habit then makes your imagining much more heightened. So the next time you are confronted with a temptation, you're much more disposed to kind of, go through the cycle faster. So initially it may take longer, but once you become habituated, then you have found now a kind of a shortcut. so you go through the cycle very, very fast. So it is in this way, I think, at least from a Buddhist understanding, the cycle is perpetuated. And so, one area where the Buddhist psychology seems to be quite good at is to, really kind of unpack the various links in the chain. Because in the end, like science, the fundamental explanatory principle in Buddhist psychology and Buddhist thought is also causality. The fundamental explanatory principle is causality, and understanding a phenomena needs to be grounded in understanding the causation the causality of that phenomenon. So that's why in Buddhist psychology and Buddhist thought, there is a tremendous emphasis placed on trying to kind of, dissect the various components of a phenomena or a construct so that we can get a more fine-tuned understanding of the processes that are involved. So this, in conclusion, what I have is a couple of points that I'm going to throw out there, drawn from what I presented, which can be seen as a kind of also a summary, but also points that could be brought as a basis for kind of, bringing the two perspectives together. I have not talked about any kind of, contemplative practices that could be brought up to deal with these issues, such as craving, because this is what my colleague Matthew Rika is going to do. We have kind of divided our labor. I will do the more theoretical, the kind of the conceptual understanding of the Buddhist view, and Matthew will present more from the experience and contemplative practice perspective on treatment and potential clinical adaptations of Buddhist practices. So to give some concluding points, at least in the understanding of Buddhist psychology, there is an understanding that craving is really primarily about experience. It's not really about the object. It's, if anything, it's secondarily about the object. So it's really about the experience. And then imaginings or inappropriate, mentation play a key role in formation of craving. So just because you have an experience need not necessarily lead to craving. You need to have this kind of fantasizing or imagining. Then, now one thing that is maybe a bit more controversial, in Buddhist understanding, there seems to be a suggestion that there is something about the experience of sensory gratification that makes it addictive. So there is something about, so if this is one way in which you can understand the consumerist culture and why we continue to hoard. One thing that struck me several years ago, I read a book called Guns, Germs and Steels by Jared Diamond. And the book opens with a beautiful interaction between him as an anthropologist doing a field work in somewhere on an island in the Pacific Islands, Pacific Ocean. And the native person asked him, saying, "Why is it that you white people have so much stuff? You have so many things, you need so much stuff and you have so much stuff." And he says that the whole book is an attempt to answer that simple question. And then the book is a massive book that ends up being an anthropological history of societies and civilization, and greed as well. So this I think has some connection here. In the Buddhist texts, there is this understanding that there is something about the sensory experience and gratification that has an addictive quality to it. And I know that in the popular discussion, often there is a lot of debate on whether some particular substance is addictive. There's a big debate on Coca-Cola, whether it's addictive or not. And then, at least according to Buddhist psychology, addiction may be understood as an extreme end of a spectrum. So it's not really a separate phenomena, discrete from everything else that we are familiar with. It's really an extreme end of a spectrum within a family of desire, wanting, attachment, and craving. So it's really kind of there's part of a spectrum. And so the temporal distinction between craving and grasping seems to suggest there is a kind of differences within the stages of craving. So it could be more of an intensity of degree. And one way of looking at this between different degrees of craving and grasping may be looking at the loss of self-control, or technically in psychology language we will say the loss of agency. And I think this, and in the Buddhist psychology, generally all the afflictions, not just craving, but attachment, anger, are also considered to have that component, which when they arise, one of their side effects is the loss of control on the part of the person who's experiencing them, if it is strong anger or attachment. So there is an understanding that these emotions, when they arise, they rob you of freedom. So, and this is particularly true in the case of craving and grasping. So the intensity may be understood more in terms of, the progressive loss of self-control. How much self-control that has been lost can be correlated with the intensity of the craving. Habituation.
Self-control, self-discipline, because awareness ignorance.
So here again, His Holiness was pointing out that when we talk about self-control and self-discipline, the key role being played is that of awareness. Whereas when you move into the opposite of that, which is the loss of control, then there is a delusion or ignorance in Buddhist language.
So education becomes very important, even at the primary level.
Primary level, yeah.
And deeper level also education. So that's a unique about a human being. Our brain has such ability, potential, that we must use that. Sometimes I think brain may tell us, level His
Holiness is saying that the brain might tell us, human brain might want to tell us that, I'm very bright, but why is it that you are not using my full potential and you are just acting like animals and being caught up just in the level of experience of sensory modalities? He's only saying not to use the brain's potential fully is a waste. So to carry on,
that ability used for destruction, not for peace, not for genuine inner peace. Pity.
So if you just let emotions take you over, such as strong anger, then it's a sort of a waste of brain's potential.
Our intelligence becomes boast because of the disposal of these destructive emotions. Very sad.
So another point is habituation in the Buddhist language, but in neuroscience and psychology language, sensitization is a key to perpetuating the cycle. So Kent made that point very powerfully. And so from the Buddhist understanding, that the fact that there are key links in the chain of causation suggests, it could offer different stages that are possible for intervention that could break the cycle. So it's not just working at the end or right at the beginnings, but there are different stages in the links. There are different links in the chain, which at least in principle suggest different ways of intervening at different stages. And for many, initially, as Vasubandhu suggests, the most effective intervention may be to modify behavior through changing the environment. If you create your environment in such a way that it does not remind you the temptation or the cues. Talking about this, when my wife Sophie, she's here, she and I moved to Montreal. One of the things that I did, taking this principle into account, was not to have any television on the main floor. Because
I doubt. Montreal also modern city.
But on the main floor, we don't have the television. So just simply changing that simple fact, we watch less TV because it's less convenient. I mean, you have to, in order to watch TV, you have to go downstairs to the basement. And so I think this is a very important, often we underestimate the power of this kind of approach. Simply changing the environment really has a huge impact. At least that's what I have found most helpful. Because otherwise you're constantly challenging your temptation, and you are called to exercise your will, and being asked to constantly apply your will is harder. Whereas if you create an environment, and this is one of the reasons why something like Alcohol Anonymous is quite a powerful treatment, because you are creating a context, an environment. So, there's actually a phrase which says that, at the beginner stage, instead of applying direct antidotes, avoidance of the situation is a more effective strategy. And I think this is I don't think we should underestimate this particular approach. And then finally, as opposed to avoidance and changing the environment, there could be active interventions, which Matthew would speak largely on. It may involve bringing mindfulness when the fantasizing process begins. Now, this is probably tough, because once you start imagining, if you can catch there, then you stop the spiral. You can catch yourself. But that probably would demand a fair bit of mental training. And then if you can bring awareness when the craving arises, now that bringing awareness when the craving arises is probably easier than the so it's, I think, depending upon where you are in the temporal stage. And then you could have applying specific antidotes to craving. So whatever it is, whether it is substance abuse or whatever. And then when actually a craving does lead to action, then again, if you can bring awareness, after the fact, it may be in the form of a recognition, it may be form of an admission, but if you can, even after the fact, if you can bring awareness, that can have a, impact. And then, consciously connecting with the resolve not to repeat the act. I think that is an important one. You need to consciously connect with that kind of resolve. And finally, all of these approaches needs to be grounded in some kind of strong intention that you have to set to overcome your excessive craving. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimpa, so much.
So now I will revert back to my own traditional role as His Holiness's interpreter, so that in the conversation I will assist His Holiness as his interpreter rather than speak in my own voice. Thank you.
Well, actually, I am reminded very much of Francisco, who used to move out of the moderator's role to the scientist's role, to the philosopher's role, and practitioner's role. So I think we do want to call upon you, if that's okay. You can shift.
Sure.
Plasticity. So thank you, Jimpa, so much. That was very illuminating, I think, for many of us in the West. And what I suggest that we do is that we open the discussion to our entire circle here to offer not only perspectives on what Jimpa shared with us, but also, and concerns, but also questions that we can address as a whole community. But in a way, I'd like to start, if this is okay, Mark, I'd like to start with a few comments from Richie and how this maps on to what Kent presented this morning.
Jimbala, thank you so much. I think that the map that you depicted from the Indian tradition and from Buddhist psychology really, I think, meshes quite well with the map of the brain that we were given by Kent. And I think that there are many sources of commonality. I think that you clearly, the notion of how craving leads to grasping I think, very, very nicely reinforces the notion that desire or that liking is not necessary. We can enter this cycle without hedonic pleasure. It's something that can be self-perpetuating, and I think in that sense it resonates with the central theme that Kent described this morning. I also think that the notion of addiction being the end of a spectrum is so important and is really consistent with a frame that we have introduced from the very beginning of this meeting, and allows us to consider many different aspects of behavior, not just the most extreme. And as you said, when we view it in that way, it touches each of our lives. There's no one really who escapes from that. One of the things that you mentioned at the end about changing the environment and how changing the environment can be very helpful, I think is quite interesting. Of course, that's something that I think individuals do quite spontaneously without really thinking about why they're doing it. We often, at our workplace, many people will put pictures of important people, of loved ones, at their workplace to serve as important cues and reminders. And in many ways, that's changing their environment. But one of the things that I'd actually like to raise to the neuroscientists is one of the areas of the brain that we haven't talked about so far, but has been implicated in recent neuroscientific studies of addiction, and maybe Nora can comment on this, is an area of the brain that plays a very important role in the ability to understand and adapt to different contexts, to different environments, and that's the hippocampus. And there is some evidence to suggest that, and this is an area of the brain where we know that there is neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells. That's quite been definitively established now. And there's some evidence that in among certain kinds of substance abusers, there are impairments in the hippocampus, and that may also interfere with neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells in the hippocampus. And that may actually lead to a diminished capacity to have a change in the environment actually influence behavior in the way that a change in environment would influence behavior in someone who is less extreme on this continuum. And so while I think that's a very important antidote, it may be one that pertains mostly to people at certain points on the continuum, but not perhaps all the way on the extreme. So I don't know if Kent or Nora want to comment on that.
Hippocampus the lega Sane Niju Sabatandeli Lamsa adapt to it, hippocampus something the hippocampus Nalian, neuron Saba Kigyo, conscious to yours. The Netan the Ngom showed in Yambuchi, hippocampus like Nyamje, taking any Kuyu Jebulovi, Titon Colia, then did the young Epon Batigitone, call Shukan Tattoo Ions, Takata Ngom Settle Letabena, that Settle Lemena, you young Epon that the Dictone gave up my 2 minutes.
Yes, and what we now know, and I apologize for not being yesterday here, but that areas of the brain form networks, and the hippocampus is actually fundamental in enabling us to remember where things are. So for food, where did food lay? And that's why it's so strongly associated with desires and wanting. But there's another area in the network which is actually extremely important on the craving that you were discussing, which is the orbital frontal cortex, because it's the area of the brain that assigns value. So value of water when I'm thirsty. If I damage that orbital frontal cortex, I drink and I drink and I drink and I drink water, even though it should no longer be physiologically important. And that is, in my view, at the essence very much of the negative component of craving. Because the component of craving for water when I'm thirsty is crucial for survival. And so and that is the orbital frontal cortex, which in connection with the hippocampus enables us to shift our behavior when this in the context is no longer valuable, so I can then seek something that may be. But if I may ask you a question, because I was very curious on your presentation, like they say, desires can be positive, but in the Buddhist psychology, can craving be also considered positive and indispensable under certain contexts?
Wholesome craving.
Well, actually, the way in which Buddhist psychology understands craving is it's craving by its very nature has a compulsive element to it. So therefore, craving is really seen as negative or destructive. It has this, so you can have aspirations or wishes or wants that need not have this compulsive component. Craving not only has this very narrow focus of the object of your craving, but also has this very obsessive, compulsive element to it, which makes it negative.
And I was asking because what jumped into my brain was romantic love, where you basically become obsessed.
Yes.
And there is that compulsive element.
Yes.
And yet it has become fundamental for humans. It creates a state of hyperdrive that will ensure that you form a bonding. But it has many of the compulsive qualities that you were describing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
but it's that negative.
Well, negative. I mean, it has that seed. I mean, this is one of the reasons why intimate relations in the context of romantic relations become such a source of agony when things do go wrong. You're right. It's a very important part of the human relations. But because of that intensity, because of that compulsiveness, it's also a kind of relation that has this potential for toxicity when things go wrong. So by itself, we cannot say it's negative, but the obsessive component of it would be the negative part of it.
Causality.
This question is interesting in relation to attention. The narrow focus of attention in the experience of craving.
Yeah, but also, for example, in the romantic context, speaking about romantic relations, when the obsessive component becomes heightened, it can be suffocating for the other person.
So why don't
let's no. 그게 가소래. 다 대샤한테 되는 자스럽이나. 또 조조로도 로 초스로지 차대고. 다양 자와 직직이 그런 거냐 전에 그게 배나 사자 편수 차샤나. 그런 거냐나 백직직 그지 직직 그게 가소래 그게 직편지로 소리지. 다 근데 전에는 즉 그질래 되지. 자와지도 가. 진짜도 가.
So Solins was saying that, say, for example, in the context of spouse relations and love, one can talk about two types. One is a love where there is a very strong attachment involved in it, but there could be similarly another kind of love between the couples, where the love is really rooted in some kind of recognition of the other person and valuing it. And there is a genuine respect at the level. Whereas the first type of love has more to do with kind of attraction. And it also has this strong attachment component.
And go biased.
Then, of course, there's a very strong bias that comes in there.
I usually used to telling the attachment mainly oriented about others' attitude. Then genuine love, the other,
to the person, no?
a person, himself or herself. So there, the closeness feeling, at the same time, respect, appreciation.
So I think we could also, romantic love is a good example of what we're talking about. But let's go to the first relationship, the relationship between the infant and the parent, which has been called attachment theory in psychology for the last 40 years. This is the fundamental attachment. And it's necessary, right? And it has nothing to do with respect. It's more primitive than that. So when...
That's attachment.
So when the baby who is attached to the mother, for example,
yes,
when the baby approaches the mother, and it's not always. Mostly the baby is happy to play. But when the baby approaches the mother, it's when they're feeling fearful, when they're feeling alone, isolated, and they need to have some comfort.
Yes.
Well, in addiction, we're looking for a causal connection that will take this cycle and connect one cycle to the next. And you've talked about reinforcement, very important. But reinforcement is not just sensory pleasure. Reinforcement is often relief, right? And if you think that, if you consider that, if you take 10 addicts at random, 6 to 8 of them will have had a traumatic, psychologically traumatic episode in their life. These people are miserable already. Something is bothering them, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Okay, so the reinforcement for them is not necessarily sensory pleasure. It could be a kind of relief. And that could be the glue that connects the cycle and brings it around the next time. And it's not just because, heroin and cocaine feel good.
Yes.
They also focus you. And people who have had traumas or babies who are alone in the room, they're chaotic. They don't know where to focus. They don't know where to go. So the attachment creates a direction which focuses you and brings you coherence, makes you coherent. It's a kind of reinforcement.
Thank you, Mark.
Arthur? Yes,
this comes back to...
attachment.
Yes. So even in the example of
biological factor.
So even in the example of child-mother bond and the attachment theory of that.
So that attachment cannot extend towards your enemy or neutral people. However, so that is biased. However, the passage here, kasure. When you turn the boot soil, you that the Mazze Gangyati, Pando Yudavichin, Korkora, because of that. Then Kajilation will be called Yandar, Shacho, Mero, sometimes.
So, say.
And the Roshi is tell that?
I think here there might be some kind of, complication arising from the usage of the same term, but meaning differently. His Holiness was saying that in the case of a child-mother bond, if we use the term attachment in that context, there is definitely a biological drive which makes the mother and the child connected and bond. And in that sense, there will be an emotional connection between the two, which has no toxic quality. So which is but that, if we call that attachment, then this is the different meaning from the way in which Buddhists are calling attachment, which involves some element of projection, mental projections, and exaggeration of the quality. So there's a difference of terminology.
You see a baby crying in his room because why? Because mother's not there.
Yeah.
There's something that's amplified and exaggerated. Even in that.
Yeah. I think what His Holiness is saying is, though, he's distinguishing bonding between parent and child and the experience of clinging to something which doesn't want to be clung to. And, that's different. So the kind of pathological or unwholesome attachment is distinct from wholesome attachment. The kind of bonding that you're referring to.
Can I be a little bit provocative as a neuroscientist? And biology is extraordinarily intelligent, and I've always been very intrigued by why our brain can fall in the state of addiction. Biology is too intelligent. And I've always wondered whether that state of hyperfocusing and an obsession can, in certain instances, have a physiological role. And that what drugs are doing is hijacking, imitating that state. So the mother to the infant is obsessed, and it has to be, because it has to defend it against all others, against other stimuli. Becomes the most salient one. The whole brain gets concentrated. And that allows the infant to survive. Without hyperfocus, it wouldn't. So my view is we can fall addicted because drugs can hijack that state in a way that has no purpose. And that's where I would call it pathological. And that's why I was questioning whether, in certain instances, craving could be positive, because the craving of the mother for the infant, in my view, is crucial.
Addiction the temper someone they boom to Galaya, Lord Zechil there, and Nubus Legioris. That the Pugu Amalia don't go in. I remember got the cheek and color double Pugu touching to the chair the day and biology evolutionary rules of Yorubas that did not only a saber double Lego your guys and the much go.
Logically, could talk Chavastamers from the end to Chindig, Coretta.
Yes, that's true. Solons was saying that many of these kind of processes may seem similar, but to a large extent, the kind of the character, the one, if one could use the word moral character of that processes would also depend on what are the other accompanying mental elements that are part of that experience. So the context and the mental elements that are part of that experience, that makes a big difference.
Mathieu? Oh, sorry, Arthur and then Mathieu.
I want to get into the romantic love part.
Go right ahead. We love longing.
I'm alive for that. In the this is something that Wendy will talk to us about, I'm sure, but in the 12th, 13th century in the West, this is the time of the birth of romantic love, of fin amour, as it was called, courtly love. Courtly love.
Okay.
The better? Yeah. So you have this period of the birth of this phenomenon in a certain sense, although of course it's probably ageless from another standpoint. But something I'd like to point out, and then also point out something about the modern dimensions of this phenomenon, is that we speak of being a courteous person, or we court our wives and so forth, going back to this same period. It was a period where I think romantic love, unrequited often, fin amour, was also amour de loin, love at a distance. And it was seen as a force which was almost like a heating of iron before you're going to mold it into a new shape. If you're going to take the primitive human being, the soul of the human being, you need that kind of energy, that hyper-focusing, which then becomes the heat of transformation, which allows for the arts to flourish in the south of France, which allows for the whole culture to undergo a transformation, often at the hand of women. And you have a whole new possibility that it seems to me that opens up in society and human relations. And in some ways it's driven by this force, which is dangerous at the one hand, but at the other hand softens the human being so that the great bards, the poetry and so forth of the period, which becomes the first basis for romantic poetry. But then you have in the modern era also, I think, the second form which the Dalai Lama pointed to of respect. as the woman becomes increasingly autonomous and independent, then it's no longer a possession as it was in the Middle Ages, but you have a form of love which I think Rilke's line, you know, where you stand guard over the solitude of the other, and that the highest one can offer to the other is that privilege, that I entrust you to stand guard over my solitude, and you entrust me to stand guard over yours. In other words, there's a recognition of the individuality of the other, and it's no longer a passion which is driven to for possession, but one which is based in this deep respect of one human being for the other. That you may become all that you become, and I all that I can become, and we will assist each other in that unfolding. And there's real parity. But anyway, this is just to say I think that I agree with you about the hijacking. That whole system of care for the infant, care for each other, the maturing of that care can get hijacked for a senseless purpose. But it has, I think, throughout life, a profound possibility for unfolding not only in the infant-child-mother relationship, but throughout life.
Arthur, thank you. Mathieu? Sorry. Just 1 minute.
And the Kunoshu Yoruas and Tate to the Kanda Kundukana Kanda Chig Tawam Hoche and Panama the Meme.
So, first of all, the beauty of language is we can have words that somehow refers to particular mental states. And so we were discussing over lunch that there are many, many words in Tibetan for desire, wanting. And we need one, it seems, to refer to something that distorts reality, that superimposes a lot on reality, so there's a gap between the way things appear, the way things are, and that are a source of torment in the end. So in the Tibetan word, we have chosen to translate as craving, because what else? If you have another word that's unambiguously implies that, we'll be happy to use it. So desire, wanting, aspiration, we agree that it can be aspiration for wonderful things. But it seems that we need a word that sort of conveys that meaning, that it will lead to torment. And similarly for reward, this morning you spoke about reward area, like NACC or the striatum. And it is equally with sensual pleasure, with motherly love, and drug addiction. So those things seem pretty different rewards. So again, it seems that we need to have nuances within those words. And I'll give you a precise example. When I was collaborating with Tanya Singer, we were working on the empathy towards someone who was suffering. And so when we just generate this empathy, it can lead to some kind of empathic distress. But then when we were doing some kind of loving kindness or compassion meditation, it turns out that when we get the electric shock, the unpleasantness aspect of the pain is dramatically reduced. And then the pain of the others is embraced in a very positive way. So then, Tanya said, compassion has an anesthetic effect on pain, and it activates the reward area. So I thought, well, we also here we need to revise the vocabulary. Because it's not anesthetic in the sense of, taking an anesthetic painkiller. And then reward is not something like eating an ice cream. It has so the gratification, for instance, of saving someone's life, the gratification of doing an act of generosity, and it's really uplifting. And it's different from eating an ice cream. So I got this idea of suggesting that why don't we do the chocolate ice cream meditation and see the effect it has on the subjective experience of pain. And my humble prediction that it will have a big contrast and it won't do the same as compassion, and that's what happened. So I intensely meditated on muesli, because I like muesli. But I'm not so fond of ice cream, but in my hermitage I eat muesli every morning. And then when the electric shock came, I almost jumped, because the contrast between hedonic pleasure and was so big that the electric shock was highly unpleasant. So if it is reward, it is certainly very different from the state that came out of compassion. So again, I think we need to again, realize that within those words, and possibly within the same area, there must be something else going on, because otherwise, how could there be so different mental states? And I just want to say one thing about Jimba putting his TV under the underground. Is why it is useful precisely for beginners to choose places to build up this strength.
Yeah.
And sometimes, why do we go to the mountains, retreats, or hermitage? It's not just because it's sort of nice, relax. You don't have much stress. You don't have to worry about your taxes and meeting with obnoxious people. It is simply because you need at some point, when you are in the state of a beginning, where you don't have a strength, where when you try in the real world to deal with difficulties, you are constantly trampled to your beginner's level because you can't have the opportunity to grow. So you are too weak to become strong even, to exercise enough to become strong. So you need a condition where you can become strong enough so that when you're out, then you have the inner resources to deal with ups and downs of life. So we give an example in Buddhist scriptures, like a wounded deer hides in the forest until its wounds are healed and then goes on frolicking around. So our wounds are the wounds of jealousy, hatred, craving, and so forth. So we need to, just like when we learn sailing, we learn when it's fine weather. We don't learn in a stormy day, but later we can sail in stormy days. So again, understand that at some point, we need to have the conditions to grow those skills, and then we can go in the world and then manage whatever occurs.
So, yeah.
되게 직 많다, 좋아.
I'd like to just follow up your important comments, Metula. And this is really a challenge. And Kent, I need you to listen because this is relevant to your presentation. So the neuroscientific evidence that Ken presented, and it exists in several different places. And the reason why Tanya used the word reward is because using the methods that we have available today in neuroscience, we do see that the same areas, the same circuits in the brain activate to feelings of eudaimonic well-being, which is not hedonic well-being, to the taste of chocolate, as well as to a variety of other kinds of pleasures in the environment. And so the question is whether there are, we know that there are different types of pleasure from the Buddhist perspective, as you described. The neuroscientific evidence is inviting us, I think, to consider one of the following two alternatives: whether there is anything that might be similar among these very different forms of pleasure. So, for example, from the Buddhist perspective, is the warm-heartedness in biased compassion, the compassion of a mother toward her baby, is that the same pleasure that is associated with the warm-heartedness in unbiased compassion? So one possibility is that from a neuroscientific perspective, our measures are simply too crude to differentiate among those different.
So what was your question about the warm-heartedness of a mother's?
So is the warm-heartedness of a mother toward the baby, which would be biased compassion, is that the same as the warm-heartedness that is experienced in unbiased?
So you mean at the psychological level or?
At the neural level.
Well, in terms of experience, first of all, from a Buddhist perspective.
Big difference, yeah.
Of course, unbiased compassion is very much mixed combined with wisdom. or awareness.
It's more expansive.
And that also is to come through training, not spontaneous. So it is much stronger. So the more stronger, the opposition much weaker. The biased compassion, usually I think hatred, fear, and biased love, I think always go side by side.
Interesting. You know, in this regard, I wanted to follow up on your remarks as well, in terms of you speaking about interventions. And one intervention that you didn't mention had to do with compassion, or the value of service for individuals who are in states of addiction.
Yeah.
And how, you know, that the AA model, for example, or working with prisoners, or people working in the end-of-life care field, volunteers for the dying, contexts that conduce to compassion can, I think, be really effective as an intervention.
Let me respond to this. Actually, I left much of the specifics of intervention to my colleague Matula, but with respect to the question you are raising, and also Mark brought up this in his presentation about, now I'm speaking in my own voice, I have to say, brought up in his presentation about the potential role self-compassion might play in the treatment of addicts. And here, the compassion training protocol that I was involved in, that was developed at Stanford, has been used to treat, or not to treat, but has been used to train, offer as a course to veterans in the Palo Alto area. And I was talking to the main instructor, who has been key player in this, one of my colleagues, Leah Weiss. She told me that although the primary aim of the training offer, the primary kind of objective was to see whether it has any effect on the post-traumatic syndrome, PTSD, but an interesting byproduct has been, as you pointed out, Mark, that among the veterans, there's quite a high proportion of addicts, substance abuse addicts. And an interesting byproduct of the compassion training has been that there has been quite an interesting kind of, change in the, vets' relation to these substances that they had problems with, so which was never really part of the consideration. But it may be because, that once you begin to recognize and once you begin to forgive yourself, and then kind of cultivate a kind of a nurturing, appetitive kind of feelings towards yourself, it then establishes a stronger basis to relate in a more enriched way to the significant others and your family members, and it has a sort of a ripple effect. So that's at least my speculation, but the fact is it has had this side effect.
And the need for self-medication is reduced. So the actual reinforcement contingency is changed entirely, just like the rats in Rat Park. You put them together, and the morphine is not as reinforcing anymore because they have each other. It's a kind of rat compassion.
Viveka, I wonder if you can reflect on this. This is definitely in your field.
If I can pick up on your example with your TV, as Mathieu did, and because I was thinking that the craving circle that you showed is very much what's going on inside an individual. And in order to sort of handle that, you can move the TV. But if your wife and 2 daughters don't agree, you have a problem. And because then you might have to do something else. And it's just to make a point that circle of craving and grasping and action and so on will always go on in social relations. It will never only take part, well, it will take part within a person, but that person will always be situated in social relations. So how do we sort of take that into account in relation to that circle? Because I was also thinking that, individuals might be distracted in that circle all the time, by someone saying, "Come on, let's do something," or "Don't do that," or may even reinforce it because we are in situations where we do these kind of practices that sort of habituates the circle and so on. So there's a lot of, I don't know if you could reflect a bit on that, Jinpa, in relation to.
You are right, Vibeke. 김상지 나려나 아야 구주 섬주담을 연구지 데 지금 뭐네 데주데 가두네 통액 도봉에 베겐게 왕게 향원도야 다야 도부 현다게 겐게 왕게 향원만도야 데 기바 용스 때 지조다 대바여 되고라 데주 답람 가려나스 Well, I don't really have anything to say other than to acknowledge the fact that we are social creatures. And although increasingly in the West, I know that many people live individually, but in a family context, of course, the social nature of our life becomes very, very evident. So I accept your point, but in my own example, the children were too small to have any any say, and not only that, but also we imposed a kind of a family rule, so there was no TV on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday during the school days, and then they couldn't watch during the weekends. But I think it is, you're right, it is, and in fact there is a recognition of the power of social relations on one's behavior in the Buddhist tradition. You know, for example, especially at the beginner stage, there is a tremendous emphasis placed on importance of the right kind of community that you are part of. Sangha, the very idea of Sangha is a spiritual community. And more importantly, when you start practicing, then there's the phrase called Tobongemba, sort of negative friendship, a negative friendship or negative association. And it's not to suggest that we should be negative towards these people, but we should be constantly vigilant to the negative influences that these kind of associations can have in our life and in our practice. So there is a clear recognition of the importance of influence coming from the social context. But I think, ideally in a family context, if the family members share the same kind of value, and then it'll be easier. But it's a tough one.
Thank you.
So there's in fact a beautiful line in Kongtang Rinpoche, he's a 17th century Gelug author, a poet as well.
A great scholar, really top scholar.
And he says that the negative friends, will not come out advertising themselves with horns on their head, and they will come in a kind of in a guise that seem like a real friend who cares for you. And with smile.
Whether whether intentionally or unintentionally.
So, and then they will kind of, lead you to distraction and all sorts of, scattered mind and all of these pursuits. And whether this is done intentionally or unintentionally on their part, then Kongtang Rinpoche says that you should, stay away from them as if you are, avoiding a contagious illness.
And the New York, the Kujibe, and the Tijori, the Lama Karsachisa. Nolare Kabuti. Suk de Orji. Odi. 그저 참가하지 알았대. 참가는 텔레비전 주셔서 텔레비전 주고지 이거 인사.
Yeah, his Holiness was saying that there is a Kagyu teacher, a monk, Lama Norla, in New York, and they have set up a retreat place. And one day he found that one of the retreatants had actually a television in his cell. So that Lama Nola was so incensed, and he walked in and grabbed the TV and threw it out.
So today's must follow his practice.
Yeah, so you can imagine that practicing in this landscape or in the midst of Wall Street stock market would be slightly different. But to come back on Richie's point, I think there is a common building block probably, of course, at the basis.
Yeah.
His Holiness speaks of going from biological love and care to extending the circle. So the building block in common will be intense care and concern and tenderness and constant vigilance. So that will be there. But still it is biased. Still probably it's not imbued with wisdom.
Because some attachment mixed.
Yes, it's mixed with attachment. It's mixed with a lot of other things, and it could be subject to intense stress when it's overwhelming and so forth. So the other dimension, then, for instance, if it's linked with wisdom, it will not be stressed by the magnitude. For instance, the more there are people suffering, the more the compassion, courage. Like a doctor on the battlefield, he won't cry each time he sees a person. The magnitude of courage will grow with the magnitude of the effect. So there will be no overwhelming. So all these things will grow in spaciousness, in resilience, in depth, sort of clarity, intensity, quality. So we give an example. It is the same thing in the same way that you can see the sky through a needle eye, but it is the sky, but it's a very small sky, but it is the same sky, but it's not a big sky. So something like that.
Thank you much.
저는 저기 여치야 들으셔. 아랍은 직변한 가소리. 바이올로지컬 타네게 되게 제일로 좋아. 델리아 착관데 등 주전에다 착배 차디 파세. 제 차디 공두배.
So in other words, if you compare the two types of compassion that you're talking about, the one that is biased and the one that is unbiased, what is happening in the case of biased is you have an attachment that is mixed in it. But at the same time, there's a genuine sense of caring and concern, which is at the heart of compassion. So the idea is to gradually remove the toxic kind of attachment part of it, and then enhance and cultivate and strengthen this caring, concern kind of element of that compassion. So in other words, in the attachment, there is an inappropriate kind of projection involved. Now what is happening is that you are trying to bring in more appropriate attention and intention into the kind of picture.
So use more reasons and training.
Sarah.
Yes, thank you. I'm thinking in terms of, from the perspective of a behavioral psychologist and clinical interventionist, we've been hearing a lot about different possibilities of ways to intervene in terms of shaping the external environment, in terms of early childhood education, things pointing to possibly psychopharmacology, and also hearing a number of comments from His Holiness and Jinpa from what you just shared with us about this importance of awareness and having this fine-tuned view of these processes that we've all been talking about, and would love to hear your thoughts on that as really the core of the intervention, in learning how we can tune our awareness to be able to see these processes in our minds as they happen, so that we can see the inappropriate mentation and see what that leads to, and then see when craving becomes grasping, and see that attachment and shifting, from the sensory experience to the object, and that awareness alone might open up to more behavioral flexibility and freedom, despite the circumstances that are happening environmentally or internally.
야 고마스게
들으시다는 디
저저래
저래자 디 저서로 저래자 단디 간다 저답 제베 갈았을 때 뭐 쇼버디들이야 맹가 돈은 저답 제야다 야 용해 방법에서 고유 요단 저답 제야다 아니 아직 근두가 나 awareness 대시에 된지 제베나 저답 제야 송송 디자 모랑 섬단도 갈라 즉 가다 즉 취미 제기 아니 로다도 갈디 아니 대제 쇼고 요보다 두두돌 섬단 지 제베나 대시에 때뭐 직보기 돈에야 간다 즉 콜로로부터 가서나 까토고로 와 되고 돈에 저답 제야
저 전시 된 거야 좀 제일 좀 전시 된 거야 그래서 전시 된 거야.
So key to using awareness as part of the intervention approach really is the kind of the ability to see the pros and cons. So the person needs to have some kind of conviction of conviction.
저 강셔발에 뒤 거봐 가려면다 뒤 상당 저셔. 그래서 로 정도 전에 로이다 달로 소주기도 전에 가다 소주 뭐잖아 경가려요. 소주 때문에 개가려요. 디딩이 시나마도 시가르지는 좋죠.
So there needs to be a kind of a voluntary kind of approach on the part of the person, which presupposes that the person has some understanding of the benefits of engaging this kind of awareness-based intervention. Because otherwise you cannot impose it. There has to be a kind of a willingness on the part of the person.
그런 아주 남주셔야들이 최근에도 되게 해야됐어. 내가 알아 가는 거는 이제 계속 쓰면 되고.
So there is even a kind of a Tibetan saying which is a kind of acknowledgement of the limitation of something being imposed from the top, and which is that yes, the scriptures say such and such, but what I do is something else.
그 지금도 통과 말아.
Because such an individual, such people, they haven't fully understood the value of what is being asked to do. So if you have, and there's even a Tibetan saying which says, if it makes a difference to you, Buddha, I will avoid negative actions.
It's like a bargain. Yeah. What a deal. I would love to, we have to conclude the session, but I would like to circle back to you, Kent, thinking about your presentation this morning and any reflections you have on having explored Thupten Jinpa's model.
Thank you, Roshi. Well, I think your introductory theme that our goal is to better map the mind onto the brain is such a glorious goal and is advanced in this session. When Richie made me pay attention to his question, I'm glad, because that's the question that I dream about at night. What is shared by this brain system that activates to unwholesome but also wholesome desires? And I think Matthew's point that there are multiple kinds of desires and rewards, and as Jinpa so helpfully gave us a tutorial, the Westerners a tutorial on the multiple kinds of desire that Westerners might all assign one word to. It's a marvelous beginning of a better mapping, and so it's been great to participate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kent, thank you so much. Jinpa La, thank you. And Your Holiness, thank you for your presence and attention this afternoon.